Number 1. Tao Yuan's dead and the wounds that proved it. The skull was face down in the clay when they found it. It had been there for 500 years. The back of it was gone, not from the earth settling over it, not from the weight of the soil, from a blade applied from behind to a man who was already on the ground. In 1996, construction work at Towton Hall in North Yorkshire exposed a mass grave containing the remains of at least 37 individuals. The University of Bradford forensic team spent years working the site. Shannon Novak led the wound analysis. What she found was published in Blood Red Roses by Oxbow Books in the year 2000, and it has not been seriously contested since. The wounds tell a story the Chronicle record does not. Towton is documented as the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The Yorkist and Lancastrian armies met on Palm Sunday in 1461 in a snowstorm. The Lancastrians broke and ran. The official account says the pursuit was brutal, but the killing was the chaos of battle. Novak's analysis says something different. The wound distribution is wrong for a melee. In hand-to-hand combat, injuries cluster on the arms, the torso, the front of the skull. The men in the Towton grave show disproportionate injuries to the back of the skull and the back of the neck. Multiple individuals show evidence of facial disfigurement before death, noses cut away, cheeks opened, that serve no military purpose. Several show a single catastrophic blow to the rear of the cranium as a final injury, delivered to a man already incapacitated by earlier wounds. This is not the wound pattern of battle. It is the wound pattern of men being finished off by people who had time to do it carefully. The snow at Towton stopped in the afternoon. By the time it did, the killing had been going for hours. The men in that grave did not die in the chaos. They died in the quiet after it. Towton's dead were soldiers. The victims at the next site were not. Number 2. Clifford's Tower and the Debt That Burned. In the spring of 1190, the Jewish community of York took shelter inside the royal castle. They had been driven there by a mob. The mob had been gathering for 3 days. It was led, by most accounts, by men who owed money. On the night of March 16th, the castle burned. Some of those inside died in the fire. Others came out and were killed on the ground below. The debt records stored in the castle burned with the building. That is not a coincidence, the sources dispute. Richard of Devizes, writing within years of the event, names the mechanism directly. The men who organized the mob were barons indebted to the Jewish moneylenders of York. The crown had already condemned the violence before it happened. The sheriff of York had orders to protect the community. He arrived after the archive was ash. York Archaeological Trust excavations at the Clifford's Tower site have identified a burn layer consistent with the 1190 event. Richard Huscroft's work on the expulsion of the Jews from England places the York massacre within a pattern of debt-motivated violence that preceded the formal expulsion by a century. The pattern is consistent across multiple cities. The debt records burned first in all of them. The Crown condemned the pogrom. 3 of the ringleaders were briefly arrested. None were tried. The debts died with the records. The Sheriff of York filed a report. It does not mention what the mob came for. Further north, the record survived, and it was worse. Number 3. Sandby Borg and the door nobody came back to close. On the island of Öland off the southeast coast of Sweden, there is a ring fort called Sandby Borg. It was built in the 5th century. It was occupied for perhaps 2 generations. Then everyone inside it died in a single afternoon, and nobody came back for 1,500 years. Helena Victor at Kalmar County Museum has led the excavation since 2011. What the site contains is unlike anything else in early medieval archaeology. The bodies are where they fell. A man in the entrance to one house, face down across the threshold, a blow to the back of the skull. An old man on the floor of another building, no weapon nearby, no indication he was fighting. Jewelry on the bodies. Valuables left in the houses. A lamb, slaughtered, left beside a cooking area as if the meal was interrupted. Nobody looted Sandby Borg. Nobody buried its dead. Nobody came back to close the doors or recover anything of value, and there was value to recover. The people who did this left immediately and never returned. The people who lived in the surrounding settlements, who would have known what happened, also never returned. The site sat untouched under the soil of Öland for 15 centuries. The forensic picture published through the Sandby Borg project is specific about what the wound patterns show. The killing moved through the fort systematically, building to building. The injuries are peri-mortem, consistent with bladed weapons, and distributed across ages and sexes: men, women, the elderly, at least 1 infant. Nobody ran. Either they could not or they did not know it was coming until it was too late. The excavation has not resolved who did this or why. No chronicle records the attack. No neighboring settlements records mention it. The silence around Sandbyborg is complete and was apparently immediate. Whatever happened there was so final that even the people who knew about it decided not to write it down. The ring fort was not abandoned. It was erased. And then the earth closed over it and waited. Sandbyborg treated the survivors by having none. The next site had survivors. They were just not the ones the chronicle said they were. Number 4. Norwich's pit and the family inside it. In 24, construction workers in Norwich city center hit bone. They called the archaeologists. The archaeologists found 17 people in a pit that was not a grave. A grave has orientation. A grave has care. This was a pit, and the people in it had been put there quickly by someone who wanted them out of sight. The forensic team working with Bristol University extracted DNA from the remains. The results were not what anyone expected. The individuals in the pit showed genetic markers consistent with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry, a finding reported in current archaeology and subsequently examined in academic literature on medieval Jewish communities in England. The demographic profile was wrong for plague dead, wrong for paupers, wrong for the ordinary medieval urban poor who end up in pits outside consecrated ground. The pit contained disproportionate numbers of children and women. Several individuals showed perimortem injuries. The DNA clustering indicated they were not strangers. They were a family group, or something close to one, disposed of together. The Jewish community of Norwich in the 12th and 13th centuries was one of the most documented in medieval England. It was also one of the most persecuted. The blood libel accusation, the claim that Jews murdered Christian children for ritual purposes, was invented in Norwich in 1144. It was invented there because it was useful there. The community faced repeated violence across the following century. Nobody recorded the deaths of the people in the pit. They appear in no chronicle, no coroner's roll, no court record. They went into the ground and the city went on over them. The pit was not a burial, it was a disappearance. The DNA found them 900 years later. They had been there the whole time. Norwich's pit held a family. The next site held an army's worth of dead, and the chronicle said it never happened. Number 5. Repton and the lie about who is buried there. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the great Viking army wintering at Repton in 873 AD. It says they dug in, fortified the site, and camped. It does not say they buried their dead there, but someone did. Martin Biddle and Berthkjolby Biddle excavated the mass grave at Repton across multiple seasons. They found 264 individuals in a charnel deposit around a central male burial of high status. The assumption was straightforward. Great army dead, killed in the campaigns of 873, buried by their companions. A Viking military cemetery around a Viking warrior chieftain. Kat Jarman at the University of Bristol ran isotope analysis on the remains and published the results in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2018. The isotopes tell you where a person grew up by reading the chemistry of their bones against the chemistry of the water and food they consumed in childhood. The majority came from Scandinavia. That part fit. What didn't fit was everything else. The demographic spread is not a military cemetery. A military cemetery is overwhelmingly young adult males. Repton contains women. It contains older individuals. It contains people whose bone density and skeletal wear patterns suggest lives of agricultural labor rather than warfare. Jarman's analysis confirmed that a significant portion of the Repton dead were not soldiers. They were people, Scandinavian people, many of them, but not fighters. The Chronicle gave us an army wintering at Repton. The bones gave us a community, who they were, how they died, and why they are buried in a mass grave around a warrior chieftain rather than in individual graves in their home settlements, are questions the isotope analysis opened and did not close. The Great Army was at Repton, so was someone else. The Chronicle only mentioned one of them. Repton's dead crossed the sea to die there. The dead at the next site never left home, and the institution that killed them wrote it into law first. Number 6. Oxford's Bones and Aethelred's Charter. In 28, construction beneath St. John's College, Oxford exposed a mass grave. Thames Valley Archaeological Services documented between 34 and 38 individuals. The forensic analysis showed perimortem burning, blade injuries, and a demographic profile concentrated in young adult males. The burning had happened to living or recently dead people. The heat damage was not post-depositional. The bodies had not been buried. They had been burned where they were and covered when the burning was done. The date came back to around the year 1002. Aethelred II had issued a charter that year, It ordered the killing of all Danes living in England on St. Brice's Day, the 13th of November. The charter survives. Aethelred wrote it himself. He explains his reasoning. The Danes in England were planning a revolt, planning to kill him and seize the kingdom. The massacre was preemptive. It was self-defense dressed in royal language and filed in the archive. The forensic profile of the Oxford dead dismantles the charter's framing precisely. Aethelred described his targets as a coordinated threat, armed men with a plan. The dead in the pit are young adult males, which fits, but the wound analysis shows no injuries consistent with armed resistance. No defensive wounds on the forearms. No evidence of a fight. The blade injuries are to the back, the top of the skull, the neck. These men ran into a building and someone set it on fire. When the fire didn't finish the job, blades did. They were not intercepted mid-conspiracy. They were hunted. Aethelred's charter is one of the most remarkable documents in English medieval history. A king writing down his own order for an ethnic massacre and framing it as justice. The forensic record beneath St. John's College is the answer the charter was not expecting. The bones do not describe a conspiracy. They describe people trying to get away from a fire. Aethelred wrote down what he did and called it justice. The next institution didn't write anything at all, and that silence has its own forensic record. Number 7. Béziers and the grave that isn't there. In July of 1209, the crusading army assembled by Pope Innocent III arrived at the walls of Béziers. The city's population had refused to hand over its Cathar residents. The legate commanding the army was asked how the soldiers should distinguish Cathars from Catholics when the walls came down. The answer, attributed to Arnaud Amari in Caesarius of Heisterbach's chronicle written within living memory of the event, was, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Caesarius claims 20,000 dead, the city's entire population. Jean-Louis Biguet at the École Normale Supérieure has spent decades on the Cathar Crusade. His analysis revises the toll significantly downward. Medieval chroniclers inflated death figures routinely, and Caesarius was writing to glorify the crusade, not to document it accurately. The true number of dead at Béziers was almost certainly lower than 20,000. Biguet's work is the mainstream academic position, and it is reasonable. Here is the problem. Béziers is a walled city of significant size. A massacre of even a fraction of 20,000 people, say 3,000, say 5,000, would leave a forensic signature in the ground, mass graves, burned deposits, skeletal remains outside consecrated burial patterns. Archaeological surveys of Béziers have not found evidence at that scale. This does not mean the massacre didn't happen. The historical record is clear that the city fell and that people died. What the ground does not contain is a grave large enough for the dead. Two explanations exist, and neither has closed the other out. The first, the death toll was low enough that normal burial absorbed it, and the evidence has been built over in 8 centuries of continuous occupation. The second, something happened to the dead at Béziers that archaeology has not yet found. The city has been occupied since 1209. The ground has not been systematically examined. What isn't there yet might simply not have been looked for in the right place. Caesarius wrote down a number. The earth has not confirmed it. It has not denied it either. Béziers has no grave large enough for its dead. The next site has nearly 1,200 graves, and the men inside them were buried in their armor because there was no time to take it off. Number 8. Visby and the farmers who died standing. Picture yourself on the island of Gotland in the summer of 1361. The Danish fleet has been visible from the shore for 2 days. King Valdemar IV has already taken the town of Visby. Outside its walls, the island's farmers have assembled to fight. They have farming tools and old weapons and a ditch. What they do not have is time. Bengt Thordeman excavated the mass graves outside Visby's walls in the 1920s. He found approximately 1,185 individuals buried in 5 pits. Many of them were buried in their armor. This had never been seen before in medieval archaeology and has barely been seen since. Armor was expensive. Armor was inherited, repaired, and passed down. The only reason you bury a man in his armor is that there was no time and nobody left to take it off him. Maja Krzemska at Stockholm University ran ancient DNA analysis on the Visby remains, published in PLOS I in 2018. The genetic profile confirmed what Thordeman's skeletal analysis had already suggested. These were not mercenaries or professional soldiers. The DNA matched the local Gotlandic population. Farmers, craftsmen, the people who worked the land outside the city walls. Valdemar's professional army met the island's civilian defenders on an open field and went through them. The wound analysis is the most specific part of the story. The injuries cluster on the lower legs, below the knee, at the level of the shin and ankle. This is not the wound pattern of open field combat. It is the wound pattern of men standing behind a fixed obstacle, a ditch or a wall or a bank, with their lower legs exposed below it. They were not advancing. They were holding a position. Valdemar's men came through or around the obstacle and took them at the leg first. Once a man's leg is gone, he goes down. Once he goes down, the fight is finished. The Visby farmers held their ditch as long as they could. The mass graves outside the wall are what holding looks like when the other side has professionals and you don't. Valdemar rode back to Denmark. The farmers were buried where they fell, in the armor they had worn since morning. Their DNA is in the ground outside the city they were trying to protect. Visby's farmers died in their armor because there was no time. The next victims had no armor at all, and the men who killed them filed the land transfer paperwork within the month. Number 9. The harrying of the north and a waste that lasted 17 years. You are a Norman knight in the winter of 1069. William has given you an order and it is not complicated. You are not to kill everyone. You are to make it impossible for anyone to survive. Burn the grain, slaughter the livestock, destroy the tools. Salt is expensive, so you don't bother with the fields. The fields will fail on their own once there is nothing left to work them with, and no one strong enough to work them anyway. You move north through Yorkshire and you do what you were sent to do. You are done by spring. Orderic Vitalis was a Norman monk writing within living memory of the harrying. He had no political reason to condemn William. His entire world depended on Norman legitimacy. He condemned it anyway. He records 100,000 dead, most of them from the famine that followed the destruction rather than from direct killing. He writes that he cannot speak of it without grief and shame. David Palliser at the University of Leeds has done the most systematic work on what Domesday reveals about the north of England. Domesday was compiled in 1086, 17 years after the harrying. The northern estates are still listed as waste, not recovering, not reduced. Waste, the Domesday term for land that produces nothing and is worth nothing. 17 years later, the mainstream reading is that the harrying was military devastation, the brutal logic of suppressing rebellion, and that William went further than he intended. Orderic's testimony complicates this. The destruction was not a side effect of campaigning. It was the campaign. William did not march north to defeat an army. He marched north to ensure that the north could not support one. The famine was the weapon. The 100,000 dead were not casualties. They were the point. William's men didn't need to kill everyone. They just needed to make sure no one could eat. The last item is the only massacre on this list where the planners signed their names to it and considered the paperwork a form of righteousness. Number 10. The Teutonic Knights and the paperwork they left behind. The Teutonic Knights are the only perpetrators on this list who filed the documents themselves. Peter of Duisburg was a Teutonic Knight. He wrote the Chronicle of the Prussian Land in 1326, a history of his order's campaigns against the pagan Prussian people across the preceding century. He was proud of what he recorded. He wrote it as hagiography, the story of Christian soldiers doing God's work in the northern forests. He did not understand that he was also writing a forensic record. The administrative structure of the Teutonic Order was meticulous. Land grants required documentation. Baptismal conversions were recorded. Military operations generated orders, reports, and disbursement records. William Urban at Lake Forest College, in the Teutonic Knights published by Greenhill Books in 23, traced the administrative sequence across the 13th century Prussian campaigns. The pattern is consistent across decades and across regions. A military action is recorded against a named Prussian settlement or tribe. The subsequent administrative record shows the population absent, not converted, not relocated, not recorded as submitting. Absent. Within months, sometimes within weeks, land grants appear transferring the territory to German settlers or to the order itself. Peter of Duisburg explains the theology. The land grants explain what the theology produced. Archaeological work at Prussian settlement sites has identified destruction layers with human remains dating to the campaign period. The physical evidence is consistent with what the documents describe without describing. The Teutonic Knights operated under papal mandate. Their campaigns were not secret. They were celebrated across Catholic Europe as the Eastern Crusade, the conversion of the last pagans. The killing was not hidden because it did not need to be hidden. It was righteousness. Peter wrote it down because he wanted posterity to know what his order had achieved. He wanted credit. The land transfer records confirmed the credit was earned. Every other institution on this list tried to manage what the record said. The Teutonic Knights had no such concern. They believed they were doing what God required. They documented it thoroughly. They signed their names. The archive is still there. So is the archaeology beneath the soil of what used to be Prussia. Both say the same thing. The order knew exactly what it was doing. It did it on purpose. It wrote it down. And for 700 years, the chronicle version was the one that got taught. The forensic record is the version underneath. It has been there the whole time, waiting for someone to look.